Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is the first chapter of the Red-Headed League, second prep. We begin. One day, Dr. Watson visited his friend Sherlock Holmes at his home in London. When he arrived, Sherlock Holmes was talking to a man in his living room. The man's name was Mr. Jabez Wilson. Mr. Wilson knew that Holmes was a famous detective who could solve crimes, and he wanted him to solve a mystery. While Mr. Wilson was talking, Holmes looked at him carefully. He looked at Mr. Wilson's face, his hands, and his clothes. He worked out means deduced. He knew that Mr. Wilson used to be a laborer. Laborer means worker who works using his hands. That he visited China in the past and that he did a lot of writing. When Sherlock Holmes told Mr. Wilson this information, he was very surprised because everything Sherlock Holmes said was true. Mr. Wilson decided that Holmes must be a wonderful detective. Mr. Wilson started telling Holmes his story. He had a small shop in London where he worked with his assistant Vincent Spaulding. You have to know this name very well, Mr. Spaulding, the assistant of Mr. Wilson. Not many people visited Mr. Wilson's shop, and he wasn't a rich man. One day, Mr. Spaulding showed him an advert mean advertisement in the newspaper for a job with the Red-Headed League. The Red-Headed League found jobs for men with red hair. Mr. Spaulding wanted Mr. Wilson to ask about the job because Mr. Wilson had red hair and the job was only a few hours a week. The money could really help Mr. Wilson and his small shop. That afternoon, Mr. Spaulding took Mr. Wilson to the Red-Headed League. There were a lot of men waiting outside the office and they all had red hair. But Mr. Spaulding pushed past all the men until they were outside the door. They went inside and met the manager, Mr. Duncan Ross, who told them about the job. The person who got the job would have to come to the office every day between 10 and 2 o'clock. He wouldn't be able to leave the office during this time. While he was in the office, he would have to copy all the information from a large encyclopedia into a book. The pay was £4 a week, of course, English pounds. This was a lot of money. Mr. Ross told Mr. Wilson that if he could start work the next day, he could have the job. Mr. Wilson was very surprised, but quickly said yes. So, let's answer this question together. 1. Who is a friend of Sherlock Holmes? Of course, Dr. Watson. 2. Who has a small shop in London? Of course, Mr. Wilson. 3. Who is the manager of the Red-Headed League? Mr. Ross. 4. Who works for Mr. Wilson? Mr. Spaulding. Question 1. What was Mr. Holmes clever at? He was clever at solving crimes and mysteries. 2. Why was Mr. Wilson surprised when he was listening to Mr. Holmes? Because everything Holmes said was true. 3. What is unusual about the Red-Headed League? They have jobs for men with red hair only. 4. Why did Mr. Wilson accept the job? Because he wasn't rich and the money would help him in his shop. 5. Find an example in the story that shows us that Sherlock Holmes is a good detective. He worked out that Mr. Wilson used to be a laborer and that he visited China in the past and that he did a lot of writing. Question number 1. In the critical thinking, why do you think Mr. Spaulding wanted Mr. Wilson to get a job with the Red-Headed League? because Mr. Wilson had red hair and the money could help Mr. Wilson and his small shop. Also, he wanted him to be out of the shop for some time. 2. Do you think it was unusual that Mr. Ross gave Mr. Wilson the job? Why and why not? Yes, because he asked Mr. Wilson to start the work tomorrow. 3. Do you think that Mr. Wilson will find it difficult to do both this job and his job in the shop? Why? Why not? No, because the job is only a few hours a day. 4. Why do you think Mr. Wilson wanted to work for the Red Headed League? Because he wasn't rich and the money would help him in the shop. Number 5. Why do you think Mr. Spaulding pushed past all the men who were waiting outside the office? I think because they knew each other well. Number 6. Why do you think Mr. Ross gave Mr. Wilson the job? Because he wanted him to be out of the shop for some time. These are more questions. You gotta read it by yourself and answer it. The answer is already there. Thank you.